The first scenario is that Russia launched a cruise missile to target Ukraine's electrical infrastructure in western Ukraine. Last time we checked in, yesterday, we were still getting more and more information, trying to figure out exactly what had happened in Poland. We knew that a missile strike had occurred. We had that idea about it. Let's turn off the music. We knew that that occurred, but we didn't know exactly where the missile came from, if for sure the Russians did it, or if it was intercepted and there was also an S-300 wreckage. We were still trying to clear out the information, still trying to figure it out. There were signs, but we were still waiting for more information, and at the time I said we should wait for more information. But what we found out is that this is actually more complicated than first meets the eye, because it seems like, at least if you believe Western sources, not the Ukrainian government still denies it. It seems like that, as we know of right now, some of the wreckage in Poland is from a Ukrainian S-300 missile. And so I think we should talk about it. Ukraine and Western allies at odds over a missile that exploded in Poland. President Zelensky disputes the view of NATO, Warsaw, and the US that the weapon was fired by Kiev's air defense forces. A disagreement broke out on Wednesday between Ukraine and its Western allies over who launched a missile that exploded in Poland, with NATO, Warsaw, and the United States saying the weapon was likely fired by Kiev's air defense forces during a Russian attack. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky disputed this, insisting he had no doubt that the missile landed in a village near the Ukrainian border on Tuesday afternoon, killing 2 people, was not a Ukrainian missile. Jens Stoltenberg, NATO Secretary General, told a press conference in Brussels that there was no indication that the missile attack was a deliberate attack by Moscow. He added that the Western military alliance had no indication that Russia is preparing offensive military actions against NATO. Now note this. We talked about this yesterday on stream. The odds that this was done on purpose, no matter how this happened, are very low. It wouldn't make sense for Ukraine to, shoot the hand that feeds it, and it wouldn't make sense for the Russians to try to expand the war to other countries when, they can't even take on Ukraine by itself. I mean, there's a question about trying to strike weapon shipments before they get into Ukraine, but there's no way they would be able to get away with that if it was determined they did it deliberately. Or even if it was determined they did it not deliberately, just on accident. There was no way they were going to get away with that and get more out of it than they would lose when it comes to either more aid to Ukraine or possibly response strikes on the Russian military, like happened at the Battle of Kasham in Syria. Our preliminary analysis suggests that the incident was likely caused by Ukrainian air defense missile fired to defend Ukrainian territory against Russian cruise missile attacks. However, he added, this is not Ukraine's fault. Russia bears responsibility for what happened in Poland yesterday because this is a direct result of the ongoing war and the wave of attacks from Russia against Ukraine yesterday. Ukraine has the right to shoot down those missiles that are targeting Ukrainian cities and critical Ukrainian infrastructure. Now, we talked about this yesterday. But near this location where, the missile fell, near this, if you go a little bit inside of Ukraine, there are power plants, there are electrical infrastructure, there's a lot of stuff that's really important for Western Ukraine in keeping the lights on. And if any of you have been keeping up with Anna, one of the people I interviewed in Ukraine, or any of your Ukrainian buddies, or if you follow any Ukrainian Twitch streamers or anything, you would know that power outages in Ukraine are basically a daily occurrence now because of Russia's onslaught on Ukraine's electrical infrastructure. So this is probably what happened. What I'm about to describe is probably what happened. There's 2 probable scenarios of how this went down, okay? So the first scenario, and this is after the dust is cleared. The first scenario is that Russia launched a cruise missile to target Ukraine's electrical infrastructure in western Ukraine, and Ukraine obviously trying to protect its electrical infrastructure during the winter, where, people are not trying to freeze to death. People need electricity to, have heat and stuff like that, and, internet connection and work and have the economy flowing. Not to mention it's important for, certain medical centers and stuff like that. Anyway, they're targeting it. And the Ukrainians respond, and they sent a 1970s S-300 missile. We know it was Russian manufactured. From the records that we saw, it looked like an S-300, and I read some statements, and it seems that the Polish agree that it was made probably in the 1970s. So this is a Russian-made, but it's like a Soviet-era anti-air weapon, 50 years old, gets fired at this cruise missile. It misses. Cruise missile keeps going. The other missile keeps going. It goes, and after missing, hits the village, killing the 2 people. Now, that's one scenario. Another scenario is that it actually hit the missile and the wreckage of both went into Poland, and we're still waiting for more information to come back about the other wreckage. Because I don't know if you guys remember, but original reports talked about 2 missile impacts. And so if there are 2 missiles, one could be the anti-air defense missile, the S-300, and the other could be the cruise missile. So it could be that the S-300 actually correctly intercepted it and then it went into Poland. But these are generally the same scenario, that Russia tried to target Ukraine's electrical infrastructure in western Ukraine. Ukraine obviously trying to defend its electrical infrastructure, trying to defend its electricity, responds, fires a missile in response, trying to shoot it down. Either way, it ended up landing in Poland, either because it hit its target and then it, just the wreckage fell into Poland, or because it missed and then it went into Poland. So those seem to be the most likely scenarios. I've seen some other scenarios thought up by people about how it could still, be a false flag launched by Ukraine, where they purposefully launched this in order to hit this Polish town and then pin it on the Russian. I guess for me, the reason that doesn't sound likely is I don't think that this would work, because it took less than 24 hours to decode what happened, and it was an S-300. And if it's an S-300, then the Russians are not within range to fire an S-300. So why would they use an S-300? So the evidence doesn't line up. It doesn't look like they've done really any evidence, like any conspiracy. There's no evidence of conspiracy. There's no evidence of a insider false flag. This all just seems like quite frankly, a tragic accident. And the difficulty with getting information yesterday is, I think, in large part due to the Russians not communicating at all. The Ukrainians, of course, had their narrative, but then you get to the Russian media and you get to Russian officials, and they're either just not commenting on it whatsoever, or just saying, I don't know what you're talking about. Literally just, what explosion? I'm unfamiliar. Dmitry Peskov said yesterday, while the whole world was reacting to this, I don't know what you're talking about. Secretary Lloyd Austin then in private yesterday tried to reach out to the Russians to clarify what happened, and they didn't respond. And so that's also what made getting information early on difficult, is because the Russians weren't extremely communicative about their involvement or their lack of involvement in what happened. Because they still don't want to be implicated in targeting Ukraine's electrical infrastructure like they are, or that this could at all be their fault. So they're just trying to completely drop their hands of it. Completely say, no, I have no involvement here whatsoever. Even though, obviously, the S-300 missile wouldn't have been launched if it wasn't in response to a missile that was inbound. And the Russians launched a ton, and I do mean a ton of missiles yesterday and the day before. They've been targeting Ukraine's electrical infrastructure left and right. And so, I guess there's a question of who's at fault here, seems to be the question that follows. And then we could talk a little bit more about the reaction to this. Who's at fault for this incident? I mean, 2 people are dead. There is, of course, a lot of fear about what happened. There was some spillover here, and so people are concerned. So who's at fault? Who we hold responsible to this? Well, on one hand, Russia was the nation that launched the missile that ended up being responded to in an attempt to target Ukraine's electrical infrastructure. And obviously, Ukraine is going to do its best to not only defend its civilians, but defend the infrastructure that civilians need to survive, especially in the cold winter months when the Russians have openly admitted that their policy is to basically freeze the Ukrainians into surrender. And so you could say that this is the fault of Russia because, they started the war. They're the ones bombing this electrical infrastructure, which shouldn't be even being bombed in the first place. So Ukraine's trying to put up a desperate defense. And so this is their fault. And I'm very, very sympathetic to that. But I would also say, I think partially this is the fault of the equipment that's being used. Ukraine, as much we talk about the Western support it gets, still heavily relies on old Soviet equipment. While I was there, when I looked at the anti-tank equipment around me, it was SPG-9s, these recoilless rifles from the Soviet Union. I saw World War II era machine guns still being used on the front line. I saw American rations. I saw American anti-tank weapons as well, but I saw a lot of old Soviet equipment. And this is also true when it comes to their air defense. While they have gotten some Western air defense, and they continue to get more, as the Russians pick up their attack, not only with cruise missiles and longer range missiles and these Iranian drones, which they're using to terrorize Ukrainian cities, Ukraine has found itself knocking down the majority of the missiles intended for these places, the majority of the drones especially, like 60 to 70 to 80%, but there's still enough getting through that it's making living daily life in Ukraine very, very difficult right now, especially during the winter. And so they're using any equipment they can get their hands on to try to stop this onslaught, including 50-year-old S-300 missile systems. And so I would say, personally, what's the solution to this? It's to make it so they have to rely less and less and less on unreliable, older missile systems. I'm not saying the S-300s haven't been successful in some capacity. They absolutely have. They absolutely have. But the more modern systems are more effective. They're less likely to miss. They're more likely to save Ukrainian lives because they're going to intercept the incoming drones and the incoming cruise missiles. And they're more likely to not cause spillover in this war, which, I mean, if the Russians invaded, they knew spillover could happen. I mean, when you invade a country, you need to consider the fact that spillover happened. I mean, that's how the United States joined World War II, and how the United States joined in World War I with the Lusitania and a bunch of American ships and American civilians being killed by the spillover of the First World War. So they initiated this war, and it was their responsibility to contain spillover, and they failed largely at doing that. So you could still pin a lot of the blame on that, but I do think a decent amount of blame falls upon using these older missile defense systems. And that's why we need to give them better missile defense systems, not only so they shoot down more of the incoming cruise missiles, shoot down more of the incoming drones, but hopefully prevent incidents like this in the future. Because the solution to this isn't, hey guys, how about we stop giving Ukraine missile defense? Or let's stop giving them the tools necessary to defend themselves, because that isn't going to save lives. Actually, it's very likely that's going to lead to a higher loss of life, not only because of the targeting of more civilians in big cities like I saw personally in Mykolaiv, but it's also they're going to target like critical infrastructure like hospitals, which I went to these hospitals that were struck by Russian missiles. And that's going to lead to more deaths as critical infrastructure is undermined, especially going into winter. So I think the solution to this, honestly, to prevent incidents like this in the future, and to save more lives generally, should be providing more effective missile defense systems. I think that's the solution here. I mean, you can disagree with me if you want, but we got to be realistic that these older systems are just not going to be as effective. And if we make the Ukrainians rely on them more and more, what's going to happen is we're going to have possibly more incidents like this in the future. And it's not only the Ukrainians that can do this stuff and mess up like this either. I've said before, like a big risk in this war is just the Russians messing up. Like the Russian incompetence or Russian spillover. For example, I think a lot of the stuff that happened at Zaporizhia power plant was actually on accident. I don't think they intended to catch the administrative building on fire of an active power plant of that scale, the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. I don't think they meant to have that missile fall within 300 meters of the reactor. And I think that something like this could happen in the future, which is why we need to make it so the Russians don't just have carte blanche to drop their bombs and drop their missiles and drop their drones anywhere in Ukraine, further undermining the Ukrainian living standard, but also risking incidents like this in the future. But oh yeah, people are talking about Article 5. Article 5 isn't happening. Article 4, and I think when talking to Destiny, I said Article 5. But Article 4 is what has been called, or was called by Poland, which is basically a consultation with NATO member states to basically be like, hey, what's the appropriate response to this? And it seems like most likely, if anything comes out of this, it's most likely just going to be more air defense for Ukraine. Now, let me be clear. This is the story. What I've said is what I believe probably occurred and what most of the evidence points to. Ukraine still has a different, retelling of events. Ukraine is still saying, and Zelensky is still saying, that he is positive that this was a Russian missile. And it could be, and I think this would be still likely, a Ukrainian missile and a Russian missile, because the S-300 intercepted the Russian cruise missile, then they fell into Poland. And they're asking for an investigation. They want access to the strike site, and they want to actually put Ukrainian investigators where the strike happened. Whether that is granted or not, I don't know. I'm worried that this will make Ukraine look untruthful. It'll make their word worth less in the future if they keep this up, because even like I don't believe it. I mean, maybe like look, if it is true, then what they're doing is smart, and then at the end of the day they can show everybody, see, here's the proof that it wasn't us. But if it isn't, I think it's just going to degrade people's trust in Ukraine a little. I think people are going to be like, can we trust your word? And I understand why they're saying what they're saying, but I mean, they're in a struggle for survival here. We have to understand that. I mean, Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus while fighting the Confederates. But we want to make sure that Ukraine is its word is still trusted when it makes claims, because the last thing we want is when we're talking about horrible, horrific crimes that Russia did in Bucha or Izium or Lyman or any of these other locations, that people can just say, oh, look, remember Ukraine said this? How are we supposed to believe these photographs now? Maybe they're all photoshopped. What are we supposed to do with this video evidence and documents now? Maybe they were all made up. Maybe, you know, I hear about this like AI stuff that makes art. Maybe it was that. And we don't want that. And we don't want that whatsoever. So this is a tragedy. This is very sad. I am kind of relieved that it wasn't Russia, or that if it was Russia, it was an intercepted missile and it wasn't deliberate, even though we all knew it probably wasn't, because that does mean that we're not having that historic confrontation that we're all scared of. But I'm also sad because I think people might take the wrong message from this, which the message that should be taken from this is we need to make sure Ukraine has the best equipment possible to confront these incoming threats. Because if they have to use these older Soviet equipment, it's gonna, produce a worse and worse result. I mean, we can just look over at Russia and the equipment they're giving their soldiers, these old rusty AKs and T-62s, which a lot of them, like the main gun doesn't even work. I mean, these equipment shortages that the Russians are facing, not of no equipment, but of just high quality equipment, that degrades their effectiveness. That degrades their ability to fight Ukrainians. We've seen multiple Russian fighter jets crash in Russia, causing tragedies. We don't want that in Ukraine. Definitely when the Russians are striking so close to the border, which is risky in and of itself. Not World War III yet. Exactly. That's a pog. That is a good thing. Asking for an investigation is fine, but he shouldn't be insisting it's Russian without evidence. Ukraine has been on the level this far. Now it's not the time to mess up. True. If it is the fault of a Ukrainian AA missile, isn't the collateral damage at least partially their fault? For example, if I'm in a self-defense scenario and I try to shoot my attacker and miss and kill a bystander, I'll get charged for that person's death. I mean, in my opinion, if it's their fault, they should pay reparations to Poland or the family of those killed. Personally, I think the fault here is like, I don't want to weigh it out, but if somebody is, let me write up a different scenario, because it's not that simple either. It's somebody is trying to attack your daughter, right? They're trying to stab and kill your daughter, right? And because when you're talking about this electrical infrastructure, it's not an attack on you specifically, Zelensky specifically. It's an attack on the Ukrainian people. So they're trying to stab a family member, stab a daughter, stab a family member, and you're sitting there, you're taking out your gun to try to stop them, and you shoot them, and the bullet goes through them, and then it hits a neighbor. Now, I think there's fault all around here, but if the problem was that the motherfucker had to use like an 1800s musket to defend himself, the solution is not, let's not give him more like effective weapons. The solution is, hey, next time let's make sure that these people are using more effective modern weapons that are better for home defense, not old 1800s muskets, which is going to shoot buckshot everywhere and like blow off half the wall because he wanted to use a blunderbuss or whatever. So I do think there's some responsibility to be found on Ukraine's footsteps, even if I don't. Obviously, none of us think it was on purpose, but I still think a lot of the fault falls upon Russia here for targeting this close to the border and targeting this electrical infrastructure in the first place. And the solution here is to give Ukraine the tools that are better and more effective at this.